So let me just make sure I don't get off time here. All right, thank you very much for coming to my talk. My name is Kent Gruber. A lot of you guys know me. Just want to take a second to say thank you so much to all of you that do know me, and the people that don't know me, that's okay too. But you guys are great. Like without you, like my career would just be terrible. Like I love being in my sec Slack. You guys mean so much to me, so thank you so much for being a part of my community. Thank you very much. What's a Roku? If you don't know, they're just a series of digital streaming media players by this company called Roku Inc. They work in TVs and in these little set-top boxes. They're basically an IoT device, and I got really interested in them relatively recently because I just started seeing them pop up in my life, like at people's like homes that like I knew and things like that, in offices, and I was like, this is kind of a weird device. Let me take a look at it. And just go on Shodan, you can kind of see basically like where are they popular. And then this is when I first gave this talk, I believe a month ago, and now you can see that they've expanded a little bit, and they're slowly becoming more and more popular. This is just the zoomed in version. This is just showing, hey, it's being used. You can go get some interesting stuff when you go look at Shodan for that, and this is a nice string you can put in Shodan to find the ones that are open online. And I have something going, but that's okay. So you can see the Google Trends here. This is just another interesting point about the product. They've been very successful. Like you can see here the yellow line being Roku, and all of those little spikes up that you'll see like here, all of those are basically holiday seasons, because that's essentially when people are like looking them up. And then we can see that Chromecast has had a downward trend, and Fire TV has basically been flatlined, at least in this Google Trend search. And just another kind of interesting point about the company, I suppose, they recently had a big stock dive that we could see. And then for whatever reason, they just had like almost an immediate pop back up. And I just found this like very interesting. Like why are investors like so set in investing in Roku? So why? And it's basically ads. Like effectively what the platform is an advertising platform. And this is just a quick screenshots from BetterCap showing a bunch of communication going to like doubleclick.net, which is Google's ad service. And this is like happening a lot. And you'll see a whole bunch of network traffic when you see any IoT device really, right? But these Roku specifically are just monitoring a lot of what's going on. Like all of the stuff that you're watching, in fact, like the Roku publishing platform is what they're trying to like sell to companies like Hulu and Viacom and things like that, so they can go put their channels, like their Netflix, right, on the Roku platform so that people will use them. And so they're trying to like basically market themselves as a very popular platform, and they're doing quite well, honestly. And one of the more interesting parts about that whole platform is that it has literally an ad framework built in. Like all of the things that you're watching can be monitored. It's very, very kind of like Orwellian, I suppose, but just interesting, because it makes a lot of sense, because I want to know what you're watching so I can advertise to you better. That's essentially what they're selling, right? They're a hardware company that's selling these little boxes, but then all these hardware companies need a software play, and their software play is obviously advertising. And like basically you can just go on your Roku, and then you'll see like random things like Jeff Goldblum's trying to sell you apartments because you looked at her trying to move to a new apartment. It gets really weird, again, very Orwellian. And basically because it's just free real estate. Like you're watching the TV like all the time, right? Like they count like how many hours of content is being streamed, and they're very, very proud of the fact that more and more households are streaming more. So the whole platform is honestly like very nice. Like I actually kind of like, having lived with the Roku, I actually kind of like the Roku quite a bit. Like honestly, you kind of become like attached to like the Roku remote, because like honestly the Roku remote is like almost nicer to hold than like maybe your like built-in TV remote. It has like a built-in like a headphone jack, which is really nice. Just like a whole bunch of like really weird features. In fact, you can do like a Find My Remote, and it can play like the Game of Thrones theme song when you're like it's lost under the couch or something. It's a cool platform, to be clear. And then if you don't have the Roku remote, like you lost that and you didn't have the Find My Remote thing for some reason, well, you have your iPhone or your Android device, and basically it can control your TV or your Roku device too. And so how does that work, right? So we have this external control API, and this is where things kind of get interesting with the Roku platform. So this basically enables a Roku device to be controlled over a local area network. And so that's pretty cool. Like I want to control the Roku if I'm on the network. And then it basically uses simple service discovery protocol, which is basically this like very, very simple, I'll show you the protocol looks like. It's like plain text, and it's essentially like HTTP over UDP. It's what it is. It's kind of weird, but then you have this RESTful API that we can actually go interact with it. So we have the simple service discovery protocol in order to find the Rokus, and then the RESTful API in order to actually interact with it and do interesting things. So the way the SDP works is that we basically just do this HTTP-looking request, and instead of like get or something here, it's msearch, and then we're doing HTTP 1.1, this broadcast address, and then we're looking for Roku devices here. And so you send that on the network. This is the request that you could see like in something like Wireshark. And then you could see the response, which is going to be this HTTP 200OK, where it says, hey, you're looking for a Roku device? Cool, I'm a Roku device. And this will happen like very, very fast. And then it's like, cool, I know where you are, nice, don't need to do anything else. And now I can start interacting with the API. The API will basically, depending on what endpoint you hit, return thing like either like plain text, XML, or even think JSON in some cases. It's kind of weird. But I can just ask like what apps are currently installed on the TV. And then it can tell me, we got Roku, Netflix, et cetera. And it's like, all right, neat. So the way that like the whole Roku role attack essentially works is actually fairly simple. On the local network, I basically check like where are the Roku devices, and the Roku devices are programmed to tell me that they are a Roku device. And I say, cool, please just play Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up, and then it does. And I know it's kind of like it's not that cool, but like that's literally how the attack works. It's that simple. And so like literally it fits in a tweet. Like we literally just curl and then hit the REST API endpoint and then launch. This is saying launch YouTube. This is the YouTube ID, which is going to be the same in all the Roku players. And then the content ID, which is Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. It's a great, great song. I don't know if you ever heard it, but it's good. Anyway, so maybe. So just for fun, I didn't want to do it with just doing like curl bash commands. I decided to make this whole Golang basically API connector that I can go and interact with the API because I really love Go. I didn't do Ruby for whatever reason this time, whatever. So this is the example code in order to like essentially do the whole Roku role process. This would be like the code, right? So package main, because Go, we start package main. We import the library that I wrote. It's from GitHub right now. And then we have this just function main, and this is what runs. We get the devices with the Roku default wait time, which I think is like 3 seconds. And then we basically, whatever devices that we got, we just check what apps are on there. And then if we have the YouTube app ID, we're going to launch the Rick Astley video. We could also optionally install YouTube and do a whole bunch of other things here. But very simple, this is what the code would be. And then it has a whole bunch of other features. I don't think I'm gonna have time to like get into like essentially all the features. And I'm actually going relatively fast, which is nice. But I can also do the find my remote thing. So with that device, you have a whole bunch of different methods that you can call upon it. And so one of them is find my remote, which could be like very helpful to find my remote if it's lost, or to annoy people, like in like an office setting situation where like, why is the remote continually like beeping or playing Game of Thrones? So this Roku remote actually has like one other special capability that's like very, very important because you can't do this through the external control API. But one of the cooler like modes you can put your Roku device in is in developer mode. Developer mode allows you to basically, use the device as though you're a developer making apps for the platform. So I want to load up my own application on that Roku device, and maybe it's going to be like a malicious application in this case. And I'm going to dive into how some malicious applications can be written for Roku. But in order to enable that, I actually have to have the Roku remote. To be fair, I could just pair another like Roku remote like I'd bring if I was like going on to a network and I was attacking a Roku. I could just bring my own Roku remote and then connect it with any Roku, and it's totally good. But the device setup is essentially just like this D&D thing, where a Dance Dance Revolution thing, where I basically do home button 3 times, up, right, left, and then right, and then it brings me to this nice developer loading page. And then once I have that set up, I can go ahead and I can start installing applications on it. And this is obviously like kind of leads into a different kind of attack surface, which I'm not going to really have time to go into, but this itself is just a web application, so you can kind of imagine things that web applications could have problems with this is just one that's not going to be enabled on Roku devices by default. It's something you're going to have to enable yourself. So if I'm a Roku developer and I'm developing applications for it, like what language do I get to develop in? Is it going to be C, C++? No. Roku has no interest in those. Roku has BrightScript. And you might be like, BrightScript, what? So there's this other company, entirely. It's called BrightSign. And it actually created the CEO of Roku, I forget his name, but he has another company. Like Roku is like a sixth company. Roku is six in Japanese, so he likes companies, I think. But he has this other company called BrightSign, and it's sort of like Roku devices, but it's targeted towards more like large signage, right? So not your TV, but like large displays, which could be in like festivals. It could be like really anything, like where you see big signage displays, right? So this is a totally separate device. This is called a BrightSign device, and they have a whole bunch of different models. And honestly, this is actually a more interesting device because I can do things like sideload Node.js and Java applications on this. It has a whole bunch of extra features, like it has like SSH and Telnet, I believe. So very interesting. But that whole like other company, that like BrightScript thing is now pulled into Roku. That happened at some point. So Roku now has this powerful scripting language that makes it easy to quick and build networked applications for embedded devices. And so you have to write BrightScript in order to write applications for Roku. And so you might be like, what the? And it's honestly like kind of interesting. It's like a super weird language. And I'm like, I obviously love languages. Like this is the 1 year I'm not doing a talk on some programming language. But this one essentially is like very, very niche, right? Because not a lot of developers are developing for Roku devices. You don't need that many developers developing for Roku devices. But it's popular enough that you at least have things like weird linters for BrightScript written in C++ by a company called Willow Tree Apps. You have companies like Viacom creating, like for example, Ruby gems in order to build out Roku devices. And so you even have like people like putting it in their GitHub like description, and I just find this so funny. It says yuck. I don't know who this guy is. So, but can it be that bad? Like he says yuck. Like, is it yuck? And yes, it is yuck. So the loop counters is this is one example of the yuckness of BrightScript, which I think could be its own separate talk. Not that I'm trying to hate on BrightScript or anything like that, but for example, like loop counter stay in scope. So you could probably, so like for example, I should be able to print this. Do something with I here. It's going to increment whatever to 10, and then I'm going to be able to be able to reference I outside of this, right? Well, in BrightScript, of course, you get to reference I outside of that scope. Why not? So you can imagine how many bugs are like attributed to those kinds of things. And then they have like this very imperative style programming with BrightScript, but developers really like declarative style programming where they just want to like almost have like maybe a React type program. And essentially, they don't give you anything like that, but they give you something close with this thing called scene graph, which is basically BrightScript with XML, which just sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And so this would be a hello world with scene graph, but you don't just get to do this. You also still need to do BrightScript with it. So it's really just wrapping more XML in BrightScript, which is interesting. And then BrightScript itself is actually relatively full-featured. I mean, it doesn't have everything that you want in a language. But the fact that this is a TCP server that I believe is asynchronous in BrightScript is pretty gnarly. Obviously, you're not supposed to read this code, but this is just more or less showing you that I could have an application loaded that is a full working TCP server, asynchronous connections on a Roku device if I wanted it. It's just kind of cool more than anything else. And then it has a whole bunch of other features like built into the platform, right? So one of the more interesting ones I'm just kind of pulling out here, for example, the microphone API. So I can have access to the microphone because there's on my Roku remote, there's a microphone, which is useful because I can be like, hey, Roku, search for whatever, right? But we also have, I can also create my own events for the external control API using the RO input API, the URL transfer API. So if I want to send something somewhere. And then if I want to do any sort of OpenSSL encryption, I have RSA there. And so these kind of be put together into an interesting kind of platform, right? Where I could, in theory, just listen from your Roku remote and send that data anywhere I want, right? But like, what does that give us, though, right? In Roku, I'm not allowed to listen to the microphone unless you allow it, right? So that makes the attack kind of lame because, all right, they're always going to have to allow the microphone access, right? But we can totally get around that in the Roku settings if we just decide to go to settings, privacy, microphone, channel microphone access, and then select always allow, which is super great because I can do this from the external control API automatically. And so, like, why is that even there? I don't know. Like, I believe there's like no real reason for this other than to maybe make developers' jobs easier. But it doesn't even like add up. It doesn't make any sense here. This should only be the maybe in developer mode, right? So I can automate that and then just have always allow microphone access, which is great. But they even have like this crazy warning in their documentation, and this is the only example of these kinds of crazy warnings in their documentations, where they're like, do not use this feature if you're gonna like basically doing anything to children or anything like that. Don't abuse this. But like, if I'm an attacker, of course I'm gonna abuse it. Like that's gonna happen. So I don't know. So anyway, so also if I did have the prompt there, I can choose the prompt text. So definitely nothing can go wrong there, right? Like you must allow it, right? Anyway, so what else can we do? So I'm trying to like kind of expand upon the like Roku device attack surface. Like what are the things that are going on with it? Maybe things that might kind of spur you to go do this maybe at home. Go buy a Roku device. I don't know. So what else can we do? BetterCap is like the best for IoT hacking. So BetterCap is a man-in-the-middle framework, originally written in Ruby, was written in Go like 2 years ago or something like that. It's very, very full-featured, including HTTP and HTTPS proxies where I can have arbitrary JavaScript be evaluated and do like neat things to each packet they're going through the proxy. I can also just man in the middle of traffic and then like print out like what's going on in it. So like this is an example of like when Hulu doesn't have network connectivity, it'll display this error page and it'll be like, hey, blah, 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 can't get to the network. Here's this nice little image of a departing day thing, this is what the image looks like. So this is like the background of the like app, right? So I could just replace it with any other image that I want because it's just being served over HTTP, and I literally just used the RTFM caplet from BetterCap. If you go look at BetterCap, they have these things called caplets. Caplets are basically almost like bash scripts for your BetterCap shell. And so you can have all of the commands that you would run in your run in a BetterCap session all on a text file. And then this was just one that I literally copied and pasted from GitHub just to like find all of the network activity that was going through HTTP that was serving up content type image. And so I was just replacing it and serving up an image from my local disk, which was this cat. But something kind of interesting when I was thinking about this, if we examine, this is all white text, and there is plenty of room over here for a ransom notice or anything like that. If we just had a white background and then some black text and maybe a scary image, and maybe it doesn't have to make a ransom notice, like a scary one. Maybe it's just like, hey, we're Hulu, we need you to do this thing in order to make the app work again or something like that. You can get very creative with the ways these kinds of applications are built. Another thing, the firmware for the Roku is obviously an interesting point of attack for this IoT. If I go and update my Roku, I can see that it's just hitting http firmware.roku.com and just pulling down whatever version number that it wants. And I apologize, this does HTTP here. I could have a better screenshot, but that's okay. And then once I have that firmware that I just just curled, I can then run something like binwalk on it to start examining what's inside of that firmware. And I think I'm going to run out of time if I try to go too much into that. So I didn't, but you can see some really interesting artifacts just from this one binwalk here, where we see there's this Unix path, and it says home, builder, build agent, work, blah, 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 there's a date, blah, blah, blah. And you see some interesting things here where there's actually, and this is actually something that Roku, they brag about. They do a lot of continuous integration and things like that. And so you can see that, oh, this is their build agent that they're using to build out their next firmware release, right? And you can see there's some more interesting things in there, like a MySQL, MISAM index file, and some interesting things you can go play around with. But I haven't had that much success with binwalk thus far with my Roku firmware, and I'm trying to figure that out right now. How do I basically go about working with this firmware image? Because there seems to be some problems. It's for ARM using embedded Linux. but that's all I've been able to basically extract from it. Like all the files seem corrupt. And if you have any like ideas, feel free to like reach out to me, and I'm very interested because it's something I'm like doing ongoing. So if we don't want to just attack the firmware, maybe we just go around the entire thing. We just go straight for the developers. I know you're doing continuous integration and stuff like that, right? So I'll just go find your Jenkins servers that are online. So that's good too. This is using subdomain enumeration. So Sub0 is a project that's like a fork from a project that I was working on, Subfinder. Subdomain enumeration is really, really great. And this is just like basically one way to go around the entire process. So instead of like trying to go through the Roku device and then get into the firmware or do anything like that, in theory, you could just attack the developers that are building the firmware. And you can go find some other things like staging, stuff like that. And that basically wraps up my talk. If anyone has any questions, I'll take them now. But what's up?
So the existing apps on there for like Netflix and Hulu,
Yeah.
are those also in BrightScript, and are you able to dump them out?
They are in BrightScript. I haven't been able to dump anything out. No, I haven't been able to actually get an app from the Roku device and then like be able to reverse it or anything like that.
Do you think they might be in firmware right now?
I mean, so I don't think it's necessarily in the I don't know. I don't think it's in the firmware, but it's probably like on disk somewhere that I'd have to access and like do some like just straight up like hardware hacking to be able to like dump something that's meaningful. I'm not sure.
So hopefully next year you'll have like a modified Netflix that just
That would be great.
all the data back to you.
Now, it would be possible to like basically replicate most of what Netflix is doing because a lot of these things are very simple. Like they're very simple applications. So if I wanted to replicate it and if I wanted to put that time into it, I definitely think I could make a fake Netflix application enough to like do something harmful for sure. But yeah. Anything else? Are we good? Yeah.
You thought about going all hacker giraffe on the Rokus on the internet?
So most of the Rokus, so I definitely don't recommend or condone or anything like that for Roku devices that you don't own. Go buy a Roku device and do it on your own local network. They're very, very cheap, and they like range different price ranges from like 20 to 50 bucks. I haven't done anything, but I have looked at things that are online. More Roku devices are coming online basically every time I look at Roku devices on Shodan, which is rather interesting. But most of them aren't accessible. Like, if I'm not mistaken, last time I looked, there was 25 Roku devices that were accepting requests from the internet because they're built by default only to accept requests from your local network. So if it's not on your local network, they're going to be like 403 denied, and that's what you'll see in the Shodan thing too. Yeah, so thank you again.